So now let's talk about how traffic gets to your application when you're using our CDN service. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. And what a CDN is essentially a global cache of your content that can be cached. And so think about things like static assets, your HTML files, your CSS, your images, etc. Your entire agency site may fall into the category of something that can be cached, or you may have a subset of your site that can be cached. But our CDN service actually provides that global cache so that your user experience is better based on where they're actually sitting in the world, and so that you can support higher volumes of traffic. So once again, we'll assume that we're going to example.gov. So again, your user sitting at their computer and they fire up their browser. The first thing that's going to happen is exactly the same. The browser is going to go do a DNS lookup. Now the difference is in the response. The response that they actually get here is going to be location dependent. And what I mean by that is if you have users that are sitting on the west coast of the United States, the response that they get for those DNS entries are actually going to be different than those sitting on the east coast of the United States. Or if you have users that are over in Europe or somewhere else in the world, the responses that they get are actually going to be different. And the reason that they're going to be different is because those responses are going to be pointing to the closest Amazon cache nodes of that content delivery network. So the content delivery network service in Amazon is called CloudFront. And so when you use our CDN service, what we're actually doing behind the scenes is going out, fetching the appropriate certificates and managing those for you. But we're also creating a CloudFront distribution. And what that CloudFront distribution does is put caches of your content in different locations throughout the world. Okay? So let's assume that your user is on the East Coast of the United States. Let's say they're in Washington, D.C. or something. The response that they get is actually going to point them to a CloudFront cache. And notice I am saying CloudFront and not Cloud Foundry. That is closest to that user. And so maybe this cache is somewhere in US East. And let's say that they requested that your homepage, the index.html page. CloudFront's going to look in the cache and see, does that exist? Does that index.html page exist? And if the answer is yes, then it's just simply going to respond. If that page exists and that page hasn't expired. If the answer is no, then the flow is going to look very, very similar to the flow that we showed you not using the CDN. In CloudFront, when we set up CloudFront as a cache, the cache always has what we call an origin. And the origin, in your case, or in our case, is actually your application running in Cloud.gov. And so in the event of a cache miss, this CloudFront cache is going to reach back to your application. Now the flow of how traffic gets there is exactly the same as what we drew before. You're actually going to go through an ALB. That ALB is going to actually go through the Cloud Foundry routers. Cloud Foundry routers are actually going to route you to your specific application somewhere running in some container execution engine called a cell and respond to the CloudFront cache. Now the only real difference here is that CloudFront is always returning information if it can. Your end user in this case never sees your application running in app.cloud.gov because CloudFront is always proxying those responses. And so if this flow actually happens, the response goes back through CloudFront into the cache, repopulating that cache before CloudFront sends the response back to your end user. Now this is exactly the same if you then instead have somebody sitting in the West Coast. The difference is going to be, again, they're going to actually hit a different CloudFront cache. But again, the only thing actually talking to your app in Cloud.gov is CloudFront. It's not actually your end user. And so we actually set up our CloudFront distributions to distribute content across North America as well as in EU by default.